Is everybody ready to trudge for 1,400 miles? Yay, all right. Welcome to the Mormon Battalion celebration. And I am blessed to introduce two of the speakers because I've known them both, one knee-high to a grasshopper when he's a young missionary in Detroit, and the other one about 8 years ago we met. And their biography should be showing on the screen. Kevin Henson and Denny Henson, they live in northern Michigan. And there's for you to read, and I'll give you some dirt on him. I've known the Hensons since probably 1976. He came to my house in Detroit to share the scriptures with me. And fortunately, we were having our state conference, and so I shared with him all our friends that were having lunch with us. And I gave him a Book of Mormon with David Whitmer's testimony of the truth of the Book of Mormon. And so when I started going to the early Saints meetings, he said, "I think I know you." So he's a wonderful speaker. I don't know his son, but I'm sure that doesn't fall too far from the tree. Laura Anderson, did they show yours? Yeah. Okay, there she is. She's been a real good friend for the early Mormon group that meets in February. And advertisement for that group is when we meet, it's a lot of fun discussing early church folks and what they do. Laura has been a wonderful advocate of the early church and the Mormon Battalion. She is now executive director. So I think we need to remember that it's a hard job, but they've got the best in there. So with that, I will turn it over to Laura.
No. We're first going to hear from Denny.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Kevin and Denny.
Yeah. So.
I am Kevin Henson. I would love to be at the presentation. The schedule looks wonderful. We're at a family wedding in Philadelphia, so I can't be there in person, so I hope you enjoy this presentation, which we've taped for you. An observation to begin. The Mormon Battalion journalists and others are telling us what they saw, experienced, and believed. In every case, I've been able to track down the basis for a story. They are telling us their truth. Sometimes we just have to work to understand what it is they're trying to tell us. Now, mine is not going to be a religious interpretation or story. It's about mapping where they went, what happened each day along their routes, and putting events into the proper places. First will be a brief introduction to the Mormon Battalion trails, and I'll move along quickly. Since everyone may not know the general story, we have to cover that base. Then I'm going to concentrate on the recruitment and the enlistment, particularly events in the Council Bluffs region. We've learned some new information which you may find interesting because some of it seems to cast new light upon some of the old stories. What you will be seeing in this presentation is contained in a digital interpretation of the Mormon Battalion trails. The online project is a work in progress, so some details will change each time that we find new information and include it, or as we correct errors that we've had in the past. You can explore the full project afterwards at your leisure from your desktop computer or from a mobile device. And at the close, I'll show you how to access it. And for this presentation, I will be using my desktop version. When you get to the Trails project, you will see a navigation panel on the left with categories that open to show more details. The categories are arranged to represent the main command's progress, month by month and day by day down the trail. Each of the detachments also has its own dedicated folder detailing their travels and stories. Now, since we'll be talking about the recruitment and enlistment primarily, let's choose that category. You can explore by clicking on items from this category list, or you can simply explore the map and click on any icon to learn about the story at that location. So here we go. The U.S. government's offer by President Polk for the Latter-day Saints to raise 4 or 5 companies of infantry came in response to Brigham Young asking to obtain government work contracts. This would help finance the Saints' move west from Nauvoo. Jesse Little was sent to Washington to see what could be arranged. President Polk recorded in his diary that he wanted to keep the Latter-day Saints as loyal U.S. citizens, so Polk had orders to enlist a battalion of Mormons sent to Fort Leavenworth. Colonel Kearney then dispatched Dragoon Captain James Allen, Jr. to recruit. The Saints were initially suspicious of the offer, but upon being convinced the request was valid, Brigham Young and the other officers spearheaded the recruiting effort, resulting in 496 men enlisting at Council Bluffs in a relatively short time. Allen named his command the Mormon Battalion, and they traveled to Fort Leavenworth, where they outfitted for their expedition. Their first goal was to reach Santa Fe, but before they got there, a first detachment of soldiers was sent to escort most of the women and children who had been camp followers to safety at today's Pueblo, Colorado. Previously, a group of Latter-day Saints from Mississippi had taken up temporary residence at Pueblo, and the plan was for the two groups to winter there together. The main command then continued on to Santa Fe, where a change of commander took place, necessitated by Colonel Allen's death. General Kearney sent another dragoon captain, Philip St. George Cook, to lead the Mormon Battalion. Cook looked over his new command at Santa Fe, and based upon the doctor's recommendations, about 80 men were deemed too ill or frail to continue. Almost all the remaining women, their husbands, and the children were sent to Pueblo as well. Cook then led the battalion southward along the Rio Grande, but another 3 weeks of difficult travel with loaded wagons and insufficient supplies convinced him to further reduce the number of soldiers, so a third detachment was formed and sent to, you guessed it, Pueblo. The remaining 2/3 of the original battalion force, now down to just 335 men, then created Cook's Wagon Road, this dip in their route which linked Southern California with the United States. The battalion was still accompanied by a considerable entourage of camp followers, some official and others who followed along unofficially. Upon reaching San Diego, the military command was again divided, with 4 companies being sent to Los Angeles and 1 being sent to remain in garrison at San Diego. In the spring of 1847, almost all of the Pueblo detachment participants, along with the Mississippi Saints, proceeded north, then followed close behind the LES Vanguard Company into the valley of the Great Salt Lake. Also that spring, General Kearney in California, having completed his conquest of the West, returned east to Fort Leavenworth with an escort of 15 men who had been selected from among the Mormon Battalion. Now, the remainder of the battalion were discharged at Los Angeles on 16 July of 1847. 82 men re-enlisted for another 8 months and served in San Diego. Some men stayed in California. Some were even at Sutter's Mill helping find the gold. Some went to Salt Lake, and others returned to their families in Iowa. Our research is helping better identify who went where, when, and what eventually became of all these people. And that is a very abbreviated introduction to the Mormon Battalion trails used during their enlistment year. You can explore all of these different sections of the digital trails at your leisure and enjoy the additional information contained in the place marks. And by the way, the Kearney route information is just now being added and should be completed by next spring. To talk about the enlistment, I'm going to turn off all the rest of the trails and just focus on this triangle formed by Mount Pisgah, Council Bluffs, and Fort Leavenworth. The key events of actually forming the Mormon Battalion took place in this area. Now, the Saints were strung out all along the Iowa Mormon Trail from Nauvoo to Council Bluffs. They had begun leaving in February and established 2 key locations along the way, Garden Grove and Mount Pisgah. The Saints then began reaching Council Bluffs in early June, and by mid-July there were at least 5,000 in the camps along the Council Bluffs area, and we will return to the Bluffs a little bit later. The second leg of this triangle is between Fort Leavenworth and Council Bluffs. That route is much older, being part of the Lewis and Clark route along the Missouri River. There were land trails on both the east and west sides of the Missouri River. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the Army forts in the area. First, Fort Leavenworth was 10 days' travel by land south of Council Bluffs. It was the major Army hub along the Missouri River. Both the Santa Fe and the Oregon trails passed through or nearby. President Polk's orders authorizing recruiting the infantry from among the Mormons arrived there at Fort Leavenworth on June 17th, carried by Colonel Kearny's adjutant, Captain Henry S. Turner. Now, it was not Thomas Kane who first informed Kearny of the call for the Battalion of Mormons. It was the Army that carried their official orders. In fact, Thomas Kane arrived after Captain Allen had already left to recruit the Mormons, and 2 days just before Kearny departed for Santa Fe. Now, historian Steve Alley provides details in a clip about the Mormon Battalion at Leavenworth. Click on the audio icon to get that. Now, Dragoon Captain James Allen was assigned the task to recruit, and he got underway on June 22nd. Troops were already gathering at Leavenworth for the war. Most of them were from Missouri. Next, I'd like to introduce you to the fort at Table Creek. It was located where today's Nebraska City was built. Now, Table Creek Fort is important for where it was and who was there. It was begun in March of 1846 and created partially in response to the Indians removing from the Iowa Territory across to the west side of the Missouri River. Fort Des Moines was no longer needed. That fort was where Dragoon Captain James Allen had been posted since 1843. Now, military forts of the time each had a council of administration. It was formed of officers who set certain rules and oversaw non-military funds. The council chose the laundresses. They chose the business firm called the sutler, who sold supplies to the troops, and the council also set the sutlers' prices, so there was a close relationship between the council and the sutler. Well, Table Creek needed a sutler. On the Table Creek Council of Administration sat First Lieutenant Andrew Jackson Smith, who became later involved with the Mormon Battalion. The council chose a respectable resident of Weston, Missouri, who had moved to the area from Monroe County, Mississippi a couple of years previously. He was someone the officers knew fairly well through Masonic Lodge membership, personal business dealings, and gentlemanly pursuits. He was also a physician whom the officers had come to trust, and his name was Dr. George B. Sanderson, another person who becomes intimately involved with the Mormon Battalion story. And Dr. Sanderson had a silent partner as sutler. It was Major Thomas Swords of the Quartermaster Department from Leavenworth, and he became the quartermaster for the entire Army of the West and was also involved with the Mormon Battalion. Now, when Colonel Kearny returned to Fort Leavenworth as the Mexican War started, he took most of the troops, including Dr. Griffin, who had been the physician at Table Creek. A few days later, Kearny sent a letter back instructing that Dr. Sanderson should be hired as the contract physician for Table Creek, and the good doctor was so employed temporarily. Now, these events partially reveal the long association that Dr. Sanderson had with the officers from Leavenworth and suggests their confidence in him. Now, when we finish finding a few more details about Dr. Sanderson's life, we will be publishing his journal about his travels with the Mormon Battalion during the Mexican War. Well, what about Captain Allen? He's going to be our third side of this triangle. Have you ever wondered why he went to Mount Pisgah instead of directly to Council Bluffs? I'm going to share my speculation since I've not come across anyone else who has written about his route. Now, earlier I mentioned that Fort Des Moines was being abandoned where Allen had been commander for about 18 months, and there had developed a dragoon route from Fort Leavenworth that went close to Mount Pisgah on its way up to Fort Des Moines and then over to Fort Atkinson further to the northeast. Allen and his recruiting party left no record that we've found as yet, but it seems this dragoon trail would be a logical choice since Allen would expect to intercept the Saints as these two routes crossed. Also, Allen likely bumped into Saints who were going south from Mount Pisgah to trade in Missouri, and from them he would have known that the LDS leaders were at Mount Pisgah as late as mid-June. So it seems logical that Allen's party turned off the dragoon trail and headed for Mount Pisgah, where they expected to find Brigham Young. Now, various LDS journals state that there were as many as 5 soldiers in the group, and we have reconstructed from the Army muster rolls who those men were that were Captain Allen. They were Privates Alpheus Pomeroy, his assistant, Patrick McDonnell, Henry Stuckenberg, John Staley, who was listed as a clerk, and also likely with them was Allen's personal slave, Levi Wells. Now, having set the stage along the legs of the triangle, let's return to examine some key events closer to Council Bluffs. Again, in mid-June, the Saints began arriving at the Bluffs and established the church headquarters at Taylor Pratt Hill, also called Redemption Hill or Mosquito Creek Hill, and they began meeting the locals, primarily Trader Peter Sarpy, Indian Agent Robert Mitchell, their families, other government employees, tribal members, and so forth, most of whom resided down at Trader's Point. After a few days of encouraging interactions, the LDS leaders hear from Peter Sarpy that Agent Mitchell had previously sent a letter complaining about the Saints interfering with the Indians and conniving to get the Indians to attack the whites. When asked, Mitchell denied sending any such letter, and to date, nothing like that has ever been found in the National Archives. But here's the kicker we did find. Emmett's company of the LDS Pioneers had been encamped just 120 miles north at Vermilion Creek on the Missouri River, and that was near the American Fur Company trading post. James Holt and others with the Emmett Company reported they had been preaching to the Indians, and later there had been a dust-up between the Emmett Company and some Sioux tribal members in that area. So if you allow for an easy confusion of the situation reports, that would result in Sarpy having a garbled story to tell Brigham Young, and Agent Mitchell being able to make a truthful denial. It's also recorded that Emmett himself was at Table Creek in the spring of '46. So later in the month of June, 10 days after the Saints started arriving at the Bluffs, Lieutenant William Prince, left in charge at Table Creek after Kearny had departed, decided to investigate what the situation was up at the Bluffs. As far as we can tell, he decided to do this on his own, not from official orders. Lieutenant Prince sent Second Lieutenant Abraham Lincoln to observe and determine the conditions of the Saints, and Lincoln took with him Dr. Sanderson, the two of them coming up from the south. And you may ask, how do we know this? Well, here's what Willard Richards recorded on Sunday the 28th. Quote, Brother John Kreisman came up from the point and said that U.S. officers had arrived to enlist the Mormons to go and take Santa Fe, and if they did not enlist, should consider them as enemies and treat them accordingly. About 3 p.m., Bishop George Miller came to the post office with Lieutenant Lincoln and Dr. Sanderson, end quote. Now, as amazing as that statement is, the really important item herein is that Captain Allen was still en route from Mount Pisgah and would not arrive at the Bluffs for 2 more days. So this strongly indicates official communication between Leavenworth and Table Creek about the effort to enlist the Saints, and the start of unofficial rumors as to what would happen if the Saints didn't. And this seems an important discovery pertaining to the enlist or be wiped out story. In fact, it may even be the origin of that story. So 2 days later, on the 30th, Captain Allen finally arrives from the east with the official orders and asks to meet with the LDS leadership the next morning. But they already know what he's going to talk about. So let's put ourselves in Brigham Young's place, just 2 years after Joseph and Hiram were murdered. Here's a new army fort being set up just 1 day away, and you have the military, which is on a war footing, coming at you from 2 different directions. And you're also backed up against a big river with thousands of people to cross the river and feed. And there are confusing reports as what's being reported back to Washington. So what do you believe and what do you do? Well, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and Willard Richards hurriedly met in Orson Pratt's tent at the Redemption Hill. And after serious discussion, they decided, listen to the tone of this, quote, it was probably best to meet Captain Allen in the morning and raise the men, end quote. Do you hear that sense of resignation that they felt they had to do it? So that night, under the cover of darkness, the LDS leaders ferried the public arms and cannon across the Missouri River down at the point and into the Indian Territory. Allen would not have been able to see it. And the LDS leadership still are thinking they should start for the mountains as soon as possible. Now, unknown to the LDS leadership, by this time Lincoln and Dr. Sanderson had reported back to Table Creek that all is well, all is well. Lieutenant Prince sent them a letter back to Leavenworth saying things were fine, nothing to worry about. The Saints are well behaved and not a threat. And Indian Agent Mitchell himself also produced a letter to the same effect. Now, the next morning, July 1st, Captain Allen called at the LDS headquarters and presented President Polk's request for 4 or 5 companies of infantry. That could be any number of men between 300 and 545. It was not a requisition, nor a demand. It was an invitation, a peace offering, if you will, one offered while thousands of other volunteers were being refused, which Allen made as a true statement. Now, President Polk was specific in his private diary that he made the offering as it was being a way to conciliate the Mormons to the nation and prevent them from aiding a foreign country. Polk's offer may have been interpreted later by the Saints as a demand, but it was not intended to be so by Polk himself. Back at Redemption Hill, at the tent, with Captain Allen and the leadership, upon further discussion and clarification of a few points of concern by the Saints, Brigham Young and the LDS leaders accepted Allen's proposal. Brigham Young then stepped out of the tent and had the LDS clerk start taking names. 12 men signed up immediately, 7 of whom eventually served in the battalion. But to be clear, these were not the official Army enlistment lists. These should be considered only as preliminary planning lists for use by the LDS leadership. Christine Forbes, one of our investigators, has a presentation about the enlistment documentation that we found and our interpretation of it. It's online at the Mormon Battalion Association website, and more analysis is coming. Brigham Young and the other leaders head east to recruit along the Iowa Mormon Trail. Allen, though, remained at the Bluffs, presumably attempting to recruit, but apparently without too much success. Some authors state that he was gone with the Brigham Young recruiting party, but that's not so. There are just too many references to Allen remaining in the camp and to taking activities there at the Bluffs. On July 6th, the recruiting party arrives at Mount Pisgah. There they meet Jesse Little on his way west from Nauvoo. A key point is that Jesse Little brought unequivocal information that the offer from President Polk was made in good faith. That seems to have calmed the LDS leadership's fears. A meeting was called for the next morning there in the Mount Pisgah Grove, as seen here. The list of volunteers created at Mount Pisgah has 64 men and 1 woman giving their names, and a large percentage of them eventually did serve in the battalion. On July 9th, the Brigham Young recruiting party began their return to Council Bluffs, and they continued to call for recruits as they passed other camps, hurrying people along to the Bluffs. The majority of the appeal has now been made. But also on July 9th, Thomas Kane finally arrives at Table Creek aboard the steamer Amaranth, which has been serving Table Creek and Fort Leavenworth during the summer. Kane crosses the river then at Bulware Ferry and proceeds by horseback up the river bottoms towards Council Bluffs, arriving on the 10th. The next morning on the 11th, Kane writes a letter to his sister Elizabeth giving many details, and then he heads up to the LDS headquarters and meets with a number of the 12 for some hours. In another letter, this one to his parents, Kane claims that Colonel Allen was discouraged and about to go home. The recruiting party is still in transit, coming back from Mount Pisgah. On Sunday morning the 12th, the LDS leaders at the Bluffs preach at the Bowery for the men to enlist, and Kane makes pleas in the surrounding camps as well. By that evening, the Brigham Young recruiting group has returned, and they immediately call for an all-camp meeting the very next morning. July 13th, Brigham Young called the group to order at the Bowery about 10:30 a.m. He explained the call for troops and why the men should volunteer. That changed the minds of many of the men and even some of the wives. After the speeches, the Army set up their enlistment tables and started taking names. It was not, as is popularly depicted, Brigham Young sitting at the table. Captain Allen was the recruiting officer, and he determined if the men could meet the Army regulations. Dr. McIntyre of the Saints appears to have made the cursory medical examination, but he passed off just about everyone, whether physically fit or not. By late that afternoon, the Army clerks had officially signed enough volunteers to form about 3.5 companies, somewhere between 250 and 350 men, and the officers had been selected for 2 of the companies. While all that was going on, a recruitment ball was being held there at the Bowery. This is the dance that Thomas Kane describes and is published in Dan Tyler's text. This dance is usually mistaken for the farewell ball held down near Sarpy's on the 18th, but they are in fact 2 different dances. That night, Thomas Kane spent the night at Captain Allen's camp, and the next morning, Kane sketched this view of the collecting camp, which he titled The Enlisting Camp of the Mormons, July 14, 1846. Over there you see the tent and the wagon. Those are Captain Allen's camp and wagon. And in the distance, you can see, poorly, but it's there, Redemption Hill with a flagpole. Over the next couple of days, the musicians kept beating the drums and encouraging enlistment. The 4th company filled, and they started trying to fill the 5th company. The enlisting continued through the 15th, when they finally had the volunteers to form the 4 companies, and they prepared to formalize the enlistment. Recall the minimum requirement was for 4 companies, at which level Captain Allen was authorized to muster the command into the service. So on the morning of the 16th, the men of the 4 organized companies are called together in a square. There they are addressed by some of the LDS leaders, but it's not noted what Allen said, which leaves some questions. However, Order Number 1, stating that the Mormon Battalion was called into the service, with Captain Allen being promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, and Order 2, which listed some of the staff, these orders would have been read to the men who had enlisted, and they were considered then under pay from that day forward for the year. They were then marched off in columns of 2s down to Peter Sarpy's trading house. Apparently Sarpy had enough supplies on hand to provide many of the men with blankets and some other camp necessaries. A new campsite nearby, which the journalists referred to as the Soldiers' Camp, was formed along the Missouri River and near Sarpy's. Here the soldiers remained until the afternoon of July 21st. Recruiting for the 5th Company, Company E, continued on the 16th, and that's when the Mount Pisgah volunteers began arriving. The recruiting also continued on the 17th and 18th. And the second big dance, the real farewell ball, was held down at Sarpy's on the afternoon of the 18th. Some writers again confuse these 2 balls, the one on the 13th and this one on the 18th. While the dance was underway, Brother Brigham took the officers aside and instructed them on his expectations, that they should do credit to the church, to their families, and to the nation, that the officers should treat the soldiers and citizens well and set a good example. On Sunday the 19th, most of the command were given the day off. Many of the men hiked back up to the Bluffs to see their families and spend the day, and some even spent the night. Also on the 19th, a final appeal was made during Sunday services at the Bowery for more volunteers. Another 40 men answered the call. And think of this, with only 1 day to prepare, these men left their families and hiked down to the soldiers' camp, trickling in on the 19th and 20th. Now, the date of the 20th is often quoted as the start of the march, and that may refer to these last men joining from the Bluffs. Allen had wanted to leave on the 20th, but the necessary organization was not yet complete. And that gave the LDS leadership an opportunity to have the men commit to sending part of their pay back to help the saints. We have the documentation dated the 20th at the Bluffs regarding the pay amounts the men committed for their families and for other purposes. Laura Anderson has an excellent presentation about that situation, which has been poorly understood in the past. Then the morning of the 21st was rainy, and that delayed their start until the afternoon, which began the march of the Mormon Battalion for Fort Leavenworth. Now to recap some key points. Though the offer by President Polk to enlist a battalion of men was given in good faith, circumstances at the Bluffs seem to have conspired to create this enlist or be destroyed story. However, with trustworthy testimony coming from Kane and from Little, the LDS leadership got comfortable with the offer and enthusiastically embraced the opportunity. Second, Thomas Kane's influence and his direct participation in the Mormon Battalion's creation seems to have been overstated in the past, so we need to look into that a little bit deeper. Third, confusion among the various journal accounts have caused certain key dates to be misunderstood. Constructing a harmonized timeline has revealed the true dates of those events, and we'll be publishing this timeline in the near future on the Mormon Battalion website. Fourth, interestingly, Dr. Sanderson's contact with the saints has extended far beyond what has been realized in the past, so stay tuned for some more revelations about that. And now I told you I would tell you how to access these digital trails, so here it comes. If you're on a desktop unit, go to mormonbattalion.com, not .org, but mormonbattalion.com. Go to the home page, then select the trail, and then scroll down on the interactive maps and select Follow the Trail. That will drop you to the desktop version, which you've been seeing already during this presentation. If instead you're on a mobile device, what you'll want to do again is to go to mormonbattalion.com, then select Take the Mormon Battalion Trail Auto Tour. That will take you to this page, and you scroll down to download the free Mormon Battalion Trail mobile tour. We have an Apple version as well as a Google Play version. Select the one that matches your device and off you go.